Commission member meeting with some of us at the Marshall Space Flight Center. It was at that meeting that I handed a packet of memos and activity reports to the Presidential Commission, which ensured that they knew the condition of the management organizational structure prior to 6 months, at least, prior to the Challenger disaster.
Soon after my testimony, the Thiokol story began to get out, because what happened was that General Katina went down to Marshall and began to investigate the O-ring problem. And at that time, as I understand it, he got hold of some of the memos that Roger Boisjoly and some of the other engineers had been writing, and they really began to realize then that there was a very major problem in terms of what NASA had done, and there very quickly became a major problem in terms of the Commission's credibility and of what the Commission was going to do.
And I was told by a Presidential Commission member, if I had not handed that packet in, that they would have never looked at the organizational misconduct or the organizational structure at either NASA or Morton Thiokol, because their focus was on determining the technical cause of the disaster.
The experiences of Roger Boisjoly and Richard Cook remind us that acting in accord with our conscience and maintaining our dignity and self-respect in organizations is not always easy. Nonetheless, if their stories teach us anything, it is that although the cost of integrity may sometimes be high, its value is priceless.
And people were starting to look down upon myself and those of us that testified as troublemakers and causing the company great demise. And what they did is went through a subjective series of thought processes that felt that we were jeopardizing their jobs and their ability to earn a living and blaming us for it, when they should have been blaming the company, because it was those of us that testified that tried to stop the launch and the company that made the decision that put them in that situation, not us. And so we were feeling the wrath. In my town, for instance, people more or less gave us a silent treatment. At the company, when we walked down the corridors, people who we used to deal with on a daily basis used to turn away, and so they wouldn't be seen with us. And things like that hurt on a daily basis. The company was telling me to my face how important I was in a redesign, when in fact they had given the official orders to keep me isolated from NASA in the redesign. I was providing technical information and input to them, which they were using at meetings which I never was invited to, never knew they had happened, and never got any feedback. And so they indeed had isolated me. And so we were called back in front of the Presidential Commission, Al McDonnell and I, on May 1st, and asked by the chairman what our job assignments were. We told him how we've been treated, and he was visibly upset because we were being punished for honesty in our testimony. And as a result of that, the CEO commented to Al McDonnell and myself and the other three, Brian Russell, Arnie Thompson, and Bob Ebling, in a closed meeting that we held in May, that up until that time the company was doing just fine. But when Al and I testified to the Presidential Commission about our treatment at the company, that caused the company more harm than all the releases up to that date. And so basically we fell into further disfavor. And it just became very difficult on a day-to-day basis.
By September of 1986, Boisjoly had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and went on long-term disability leave.
My disability provided 60% of my former salary and ended in January 1989. And at that point in juncture, I tried to re-enter my profession and found that I was blackballed. Having prepared for that eventuality, I took my professional engineering exams in October of 1988 and was notified in February of '89 that I had passed both exams. I am now a registered professional engineer and starting my own consulting business so that I can put my life back together, get my career started again, independent of industry, and show people at large that a person can go through a living hell like this for 3 years, recover, and become strong, and put the pieces back together. And I hope that will allow other people to see that if they get caught up in a situation like that, that they may also have the ability to do the same as I did.
Like Boisjoly, Richard Cook also left his employer, NASA, but for reasons which actually preceded the Challenger disaster.
I had decided to leave NASA a few weeks after I arrived. I'd gone to work for the government back in 1970. So I'd had a lot of analytical experience at several government agencies. I'd gone out of the government for a period of time and ended up working for a defense contractor, and then was given a job offer by NASA in the summer of 1985. But I felt pretty quickly that this was not going to work out the way I had wanted it to, because for one thing, there was a very great demand for a lot of unpaid overtime. And I felt that the pressure was coming not necessarily because you had to get the work done, but you had to show what a dedicated employee you were. And I think NASA, more than maybe any other agency I know, almost consumes you in terms of your whole life. And the people who really got ahead where I was were the bachelors or the unmarried people who could put in these long hours and make themselves look like they were really very dedicated people. I just didn't like that kind of atmosphere. And so I decided to get out. I applied for a number of jobs, and fortunately I had gotten an offer before Challenger blew up. And I made darn sure that that offer was firm before I began to go public with some of this stuff. Essentially, the Rogers Commission had failed on 3 different counts, and one is not holding NASA's top officials responsible for failing to act in terms of the long history of O-ring problems and dealing with that properly. Second, never determining who was really responsible for the decision to override Morton Thiokol's objections. And thirdly, not asking the question of why NASA officials behaved so differently on that particular launch than they had before.
It had been rumored during the investigation, at least, that there was a call either placed by the president or president cabinet-level type officer to the Cape, creating the pressure to launch. You can also make a case for NASA wanting to see themselves in the State of the Union address.
I feel the White House was the body, the place that decided to proceed with the launch, that the Rogers Commission was put into place to cover that up, and that's why NASA officials acted so differently, because they got orders from above and they were going to launch this thing no matter what.
When you come to a point like we were faced with, you have 3 choices, and they're written up in a book entitled Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And of course, the exit means you just leave the job and you leave the confrontation behind you. Voice means you confront it and you voice your opinion and fight for a change. And loyalty means that you simply capitulate and don't do anything and stay within the misconduct of the system that's going on. And those are the 3 choices, and they're very high choices.
We asked Roger Beaujolais whether, knowing what he knows now, he would do it all over again. Roger Beaujolais.
Well, I had planned to retire at Morton Thiokol, and I was well along my career in my last job when this event confronted itself in front of me, and I basically have sacrificed my career, my ability to stay in the part of the country that I had chosen, and it's just turned my whole life upside down. But I have to tell you that the experience that I have experienced has made me a stronger person, and that given the same circumstances or typical circumstances in a similar manner, I do it exactly the same way.
Part of Beaujolais' response to Challenger was to lecture widely to business and university audiences about the importance of ethical decision-making, often at no expense except his travel and lodging costs.
I go through and tell them how to spot real trouble, and I define real trouble as that condition which exists in a company where the technical people spot that something is wrong with a product, and somebody, end user, could get either seriously hurt or killed. And they bring that information to company management, but management dismisses it as simply a nuisance. And so I tell them the first thing to do, that they should do, is get call legal support, for their position and voice it up through their management structure. If that doesn't work, get it in a form of position letter. And if that doesn't work, now they're at the point of individual decision making where they have to face the choice of exit, voice, or loyalty.
I think that you really have to look very deeply in and see if your integrity is at stake. And if it is at stake, and if you feel you've been backed into a corner where you really, the only thing you can do and still live with yourself is to face up to this situation and take a stand, then I think you have to do it. However, if you do that, I think, and this went through my mind many times, if you're going to hit hard, gather all your resources, gather all the support you can, gather the friends you need to support you, and don't be half-hearted or timid about it. Don't go beyond your information, what you know, what you can defend, but don't hesitate once you've crossed that line and made that decision. You've got to go at them with all you have, because that's the only way I think you're going to come out of it intact.
Once you've dug into the story behind the Challenger disaster, I guess the overriding lesson that stands out is that the features which characterize the organizational behavior of NASA, of Morton Thiokol, and the other organizations, the pressures which led to the tragic and final decision to launch, they're virtually universal in hierarchical systems. In essence, this is ultimately not about Challenger or NASA or Morton Thiokol for that matter. It's really about my organization or your organization, and what we need to do to make all organizations more effective and ethical. It's natural to come to this point of our understanding about Challenger, an event which all of us shared, one which all of us were hurt by in some way, perhaps feeling a need to blame it on somebody. After all, Thiokol blamed NASA, NASA tried to blame Thiokol, Rockwell blamed NASA, NASA blamed Rockwell, subordinates blamed superiors, superiors blamed subordinates, and of course the Commission blamed the decision-making process. Perhaps this impulse to blame is only human. So then who would we blame? None of the individuals that we might single out could be considered stupid or evil. Each of the principals involved in this case was profoundly affected by the cultural, structural, or politicized elements of the organizations in which they worked. They and we are not immune to these influences. Therefore, I think we should hesitate before concluding that the fate of Challenger could simply have been averted by replacing the existing cast with a different set of actors chosen for the same roles under the same conditions. You can't emphasize the importance of rules, procedures, proper channels on the one hand, and then simultaneously condemn people for abiding by them. You can't have it both ways. This is clearly not to say that the system is always to blame and that individuals are blameless, but that individual choices and structural conditions are interactive. There's a favorite story of mine that I use in my teaching whose moral is, what you like to hear isn't always what you need to know. And I think that's a lot of what was happening in the case of the Challenger. We need to remember that individual behaviors are systematically shaped by organizational cultures and structures. And if you want people to communicate, to act responsibly, to use good judgment, to challenge and confront you, whether it's in business, in school, or even in personal life, then relationships have to be organized in a manner which allows, I would even say encourages that to happen. After all, it's ultimately not organizations or systems that make decisions, it is people, just as it is people who construct and maintain those systems. And where those systems are dysfunctional, as clearly they were here in this case, even if we are not to blame for their creation, it becomes our responsibility to change them for the better. Enabling or empowering environments can be constructed to ensure that the messenger with bad news doesn't always get shot, to ensure that dissent isn't immediately equated with disloyalty. I think that, at least to me, that's the challenge of Challenger. That, to me, is the real legacy of Mission 51L.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
They'd been launching spacecraft for 20 years, and I don't think they believed that they were going to blow one up.
They asked what Thiokol's position was, and I looked around the room, and I was a senior person, and I said, I don't want to fly. Looks to me, the story says that 53 degrees is about it. And, of course, you've heard the story of what happened after that.
This was a rather surprising conclusion based on data that didn't seem to hang together. So I challenged that.
And I remember distinctly at the time whether I would have the courage if asked, and I thought I might be, what I would do and whether I would be alone. I didn't think I'd be alone, but I was wondering if I'd have the courage. I remember that distinctly, to stand up and say no.
We only polled the management people because we had already established that we were not going to be unanimous.
The controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
I will never forget, and I hope this nation will never forget, especially the engineering management community, the supreme sacrifice that the 7 Challenger astronauts paid by forfeiting their lives for such an irresponsible launch decision. May we always remember astronauts Onizuka, McAuliffe, Jarvis, Resnick, McNair, Scobie, and Smith for their courage and dedication to this nation's space program.